So one of the best things about fantasy is being able to escape from the real world, to be whisked off on an adventure, and just forget your humanly worries for a while. So I've compiled a list of 10 fantasy books that do a very good job of that, in my opinion. Let me know in the comments what was the last book that swept you away and made you really feel immersed and was the perfect example of escapism. What I did try and do is try and make these more light-hearted, so there's one book that's kind of dark, but the rest of them are fairly light-hearted. This is for like a break escape from the real world. It's, you know, it's not just casual immersion in your grim dark. This is your chill break from the real world, so I tried to keep it more light-hearted. And a perfect example of that is Tress of the Emerald Sea. Nothing says escapism like going on a seafaring adventure across new lands, meeting new people. Tress of the Emerald Sea follows Tress, a girl who lives on a very small island that no one ever leaves. This is until the boy she likes, Charlie, the Duke's son, is taken away to be married to a princess across the seas. And then Tress has to go on an adventure to save him. This is the first secret project that Sanderson released, and it came out this year. It is in his Cosmere, but you don't have to have read anything beforehand. It'd be quite good if you had read some of his other works so you know who the character Hoyd is, because this is narrated by Hoyd. This is really lighthearted and fun, and there's a jovial kind of fairy tale-esque prose style to it, and it's just fun. It's just fun. If you like seafaring, lighthearted adventures with a sprinkling of humour, definitely one to check out. I did do an entire spoiler-free review, so if you want to check that out. Next up, I'm going to be perfectly honest, this book is the reason that I wanted to make this video, The Ember Blade. I just recently finished the sequel, The Shadow Casket, and I absolutely love this series so much. Really, this whole video was just a ploy so I can talk about Ember Blade again and get you all to read it. You need to read this book. This is a modernized classic fantasy following two boys, Aaron and Cade, who go on a Lord of the Ring-esque adventure. This is super immersive, and I really felt like I lived in these two books when I read them. The atmosphere and tone just has so much character in this series. The first book is very like The Lord of the Rings. There are a lot of parallels in the story. You do kind of break away from that and make it a wee bit more unique in book 2, but I love them both so much. I do not think it is a carbon copy. This is definitely a unique book and has its own quirks and characters and world. The characters are incredible. They're such a varied cast of characters that each have their own wants and desires and arcs in these two stories. I absolutely adore the writing style in these books. It's very lyrical but not metaphorical. There's not a lot of metaphors and that type of language, but it is very lyrical in the way it's phrased, and you do kind of get that feeling of classic fantasy. Who doesn't love a classic fantasy, quest fantasy, chosen one, 800-page chonker? Come on. There is also humor in this series as well. It's really funny, some moments in this book and in book 2 with one character in particular, Grub Club. There is a lot more dark moments in this book and the sequel than there is in Lord of the Rings. However, I think it's so well done and everybody should read it. Next up, we have a book I just finished recently, House of Blades by Will White. I listened to this on audiobook and it was narrated by Travis Baldry. He is super talented and did an amazing job, so if you like audiobooks, it's a good way to read this story, or consume this story, I guess. This also follows a very classical setup, classical fantasy setup. There's a young boy called Simon whose village is attacked and some of the villagers are taken prisoner and he wants to go and save them. And there is another character called Alan who is your classic chosen one fantasy trope. He's super arrogant, but he's also probably the best suited to go save the villagers. So he sets off to go save the villagers, but this follows more closely Simon and his journey. I had mixed feelings on this book at the start. I didn't connect to the characters very much. However, once we got to the middle section of the book where you visit the House of Blades, the titular House of Blades, it sets up this sort of progression fantasy-esque leg of this story that was just so much fun. It was really just cool. It had all these quirky characters, an interesting setting, and it really built up Simon as a character for me, and I enjoyed a lot of those scenes. They were just really fun. And while the ending didn't blow me away, I did have a really good time with the ending. It was good, and I'm really excited for book 2. So if you're looking for something just lighthearted, fun, some elements of progression fantasy, super cool magic system, and interesting side characters and world building, definitely check out House of Blades. Next up, we have The Look of a King, which is the first book in the Pillars of Peace trilogy. The Look of a King is also very classical. Maybe I should have just called this 10 modern classic fantasy feeling books, because that's all we've done so far. I promise we will go away from this afterwards, but it's just, this really works for that immersion. But that's the kind of feeling I'm trying to recreate with this list. Usually talking about books, the inciting incident makes a really good hook. But in this case, it's really quite good to go into this book blind and not know what the inciting incident is. So I'm going to try and keep the synopsis pretty broad. There is Cyrus, who is a storyteller who lives out in the middle of nowhere, frustrated by the mundane trappings of a village life. And then we have Prince Augustus, who is really struggling to fill in his role of becoming the next king, and all the high expectations that are laid on him. As they both try and forge their own paths, a royal assassination closes the bridge between them. And maybe their lives aren't so different after all. This is a super short read, it's only 270 pages, so it's not got layers and layers of world building and character development. It's just really fast, fun, classic fantasy story. And while I've not read book 2 and 3, I have heard that they get better and better. Next up, we might have what's considered a strange choice given the rest of this list, but hear me out, hear me out. The Lies of Loch Lamura. This is another book that just has so much character and knows exactly what it wants to be. It doesn't hold your hand and really try and lead you through the story. It's very much a throw you in the deep end and let you figure things out as you go along. The world is so well realised and has so much style, and it ties so well with the characters and the plot. Just the synergy between the setting and the plot and the characters, they all just weave so well together to make this very stylized story. We follow Loch Lamura on his antics, shall we call them. He is a master thief, and it's really fun getting to see him pull off all these different heists and schemes with his crew of characters. The side characters in this book are amazing. I do not think that this book is for everybody. Some people do get bothered by the flashbacks that we get throughout the story. So if you're looking for a Venice-esque setting with a thieving crew that are running schemes and plots and heists, and a very sarcastic and comedic leader being Loch Lamura, this is definitely a book to check out. It'll keep you constantly guessing about what's going on and what Loch's planning on doing next. Next up, we have Legends and Lattes. Nothing says escapism like running away and opening a coffee shop. This is a really light-hearted, cozy fantasy. There isn't a lot of conflict physically. There is conflict in the story, but it isn't a big... You're not going to find huge battle scenes in Legends and Lattes, that's for sure. It's a fun story about Viv, an orc who decided to lay down her sword, leave the barbarian lifestyle, and go and open a coffee shop. No one in the city of Thun has ever heard of coffee before, so this is about her setting up her coffee shop, running into some issues with some local people, building up relationships with the people in the town. Just really lighthearted, really fun, and perfect escapism. And this is by Travis Baldree, who is the audio narrator that I was talking about earlier with House of Blades. He also narrated this book, so if you're into audiobooks, I do recommend the audiobook, because Travis Baldree is an incredible audio narrator. So if audiobook's your thing, that's definitely a way to consume the story. Who hasn't visualized running to a small town and opening a coffee shop? Next up, we have The Shadow of the Gods, which has one of the coolest covers of all time. Sure, sometimes you want to break away and go open a coffee shop and live that sort of calm, cozy lifestyle. Other times you just want to pick up an axe and become a Viking. Murder everybody, no? But this is a Norse-inspired Viking fantasy story following 3 POVs into a world of dead gods, warring clans, epic battle scenes, heartwarming character moments, and vivid snow forest settings. This is Norse inspired. You're not going to find Thor and Odin in here, but it does quite closely take parts of the mythology and put it into its own mythology. And I love that so much. It left this sort of blank space for there to be new inventions in the mythology and new characters and gods that we had never heard of before. And the character work is spectacular. 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 Orca is a spectacular character. She's one of the most badass characters I've ever read. And Gwyn does such an amazing job of writing battle and fight scenes. So if you're looking to, you know, charge into battle with a hand axe as a Viking, Shadow of the Gods, The Hobbit. This is the perfect example of this sort of feeling that I'm talking about, because the example that I'm talking about is Bilbo running out of the Shire wanting to go on an adventure. So you can't get any more apt than The Hobbit. The thing about The Hobbit as well is it's a really short book. So even if you've read it and you just want some escapism and go into a classic like The Hobbit, super short. You're not going to take much time reading through that. I'm not sure I really need to sell The Hobbit. It's The Hobbit. You can never go wrong with a Hobbit reread. It's funny, some of my favourite moments in both the books and the films is just chilling in the Shire. There's just so much atmosphere and magic. There's no other word for it in these stories. They're just so good. On the complete other end of the spectrum, we have Ninth House. I absolutely love high fantasy and the worlds they create, but sometimes the perfect escapism is just an urban fantasy. This idea that there's more to the world that we already live in. And I had so much fun with Ninth House when I read it. This follows Alex Stern, a Yale freshman. And in Yale there are these secret societies who wield different kinds of magic. And she joins the Ninth House of these societies that overlook the other societies and make sure they don't get into too many magical mishaps. And then when a girl turns up dead, Alex decides to investigate. They tamper with forbidden magic, they raise the dead, and sometimes they prey on the living. Really fun mystery to unravel, and I think Alex is a really interesting character to read from. And learning about her past while watching her try to overcome obstacles and investigate this death is just a really fun story. And the sequel Hellbent came out recently. It's got a bunny on the cover. And finally, I want to go back to modernized classical fantasy with Of Blood and Fire. This is your classic farm boy chosen one trope with dragons, and it has these incredible illustrations by the artist's brother. This is really familiar in all the right ways. It's very similar to Eragon. I never read Eragon, but I've heard that it's very similar to Eragon, because it has a boy, an egg, dragon. The world is kept in check by this dragon guard, which are people riding dragons, and no one's able to stand up to them. This is until hope sparks when another dragon egg is found and bound to our main character, farm boy chosen one trope, and thus begins the epic story that starts with Of Blood and Fire and then moves on to Of Light, of Darkness and Light. These books are great. In my opinion, they just get better and better. I've read the second one and the 2 novellas. I've not read the 3rd book yet. So if you want more classic fantasy but modernized with dragons, and that'll do it for today. That is 10 books that are really good examples of escapism and they're not too dark. Most of them are pretty light, apart from Ninth House, that's kind of dark, but it's urban fantasy and I'm counting it. So what was the last book you picked up that you just loved escaping away into? And yeah, thank you very much for watching again. Outro.